Yeah, good morning, our viewers. I want to just start off on that very sad and very emotional note where we are observing the passing or mourning the passing of our patron and founder of the Burnham Foundation, Mr. Elvin McDavid. Mr. McDavid was the patron and founder of the Burnham Foundation. But with me in the studio today as well is the chairman of the foundation, Mr. Vincent Alexander. And I want to give him this opportunity to say a few words of about Mr. McDavid. But before we do that, I want to remind our viewers that the last time I was on air, since that time to now, we have experienced the passing of some very important people, including Mr. McDavid. But I want to pay a special, to kind of reflect on the memory of one Mrs. Delma Lynch. Delma Lynch has been an ardent supporter of the foundation. All our cultural activities, all that we have had since the beginning of the foundation, she has been involved in as a performer. And today we want to pay tribute to her as well, since she has been a supporter, a contributor, significant contributor towards the foundation. Mr. Alexander and Mr. McDavid.
Thank you very much. Let me join with you also to pay tribute to Delma Lynch. Delma, as we all know, was considered one of the veteran artists in this country. She was involved both as a singer and as an actor. And the foundation is proud that Delma sought to associate herself with us and always volunteered whenever we had a cultural activity to be an active participant in the activity. And so we seek to join with all of those who have celebrated the life of the late Delma Lynch, a cultural icon of Guyana and a friend of the Burnham Foundation. Following on the death of Delma Lynch, we have even more sad news. Last week, if I'm not mistaken, last Tuesday at around 5 a.m. in the morning, the founder and patron of the foundation passed. Mr. Elvin McDavid must be recognized as the person who, after the death of Burnham, thought that one of the ways to best remember Burnham, to best keep his ideas alive, to best protect his legacy, was to establish a foundation dedicated to those purposes. And so he went about the formation of the foundation, and in that regard is considered to be the founder of the foundation, but also assumed the position of patron of the foundation. So much of what we do today has to be attributed to the foundation laid by late Elvin McDavid, founder and patron of the foundation. Now, Mr. McDavid would have done that because of his admiration for Lyndon Fobbs Sampson Burnham. My understanding is that McDavid first came into contact with Lyndon Fobbs Sampson Burnham when he was a student in England and became a very ardent fan of the founder leader at that time. That led to him being not only a student activist, but a PNC activist during his student life in England. Upon graduating, he returned to Guyana and continued his association with the People's National Congress, an admirer, a supporter of Lyndon Fobbs Sampson Burnham, and was at that time appointed at that time the youngest minister the country had. He was appointed to be the Minister of Culture, Information and Culture, I think it was, at that time, and played a very important role because at that time Guyana was still evolving from independence into republican status. And there are two significant areas in which he was involved in trying to actualize the ideas and ideals of Lyndon Fobbs Sampson Burnham. The first of those would have been Carifesta. Mark David was the minister responsible for culture at the time, and therefore the organization of Carifesta would have fallen under his ambit. I think he worked along with Shirley Field Ridley at that time, but he was very close to the actualization of Carifesta. And we know the impact Carifesta's had on Guyana and on the Caribbean, and therefore one can hardly speak about Carifesta, an idea of Lyndon Fobbs Sampson Burnham, without some reference to Mark David, who would have considered himself a lieutenant of Burnham, helping in the actualization of Carifesta. Also, he was deeply involved in the conceptualization and establishment of national service. There was a team of persons who Burnham had put together to work on the establishment of national service, and Elvin McDavid was a lead member of that team. So here again we see we are today celebrating the life of someone who made a significant contribution to national life by working with the Fungal leader for the realization of the ideas that could have taken Guyana forward, and national service was one such idea, an idea which today many people would wish could be re-actualized and re-implemented for the benefit of all of those young people who cannot have a second chance because there's no organization to give them that second chance. Elvin then went on to be an executive secretary in the Ministry of National Development and Office of the General Secretary of the People's National Congress. And there he was responsible for research and planning. In many regards, he was seen as the chief executive secretary. He was seen largely as the mover and shaker behind the evolution of the idea of the Ministry of National Development and the Office of the General Secretary of the People's National Congress. And so he served there in that position and was able to lend a lot to the evolution of ideas for nationhood, because to a very large extent it was the Department of Research and Planning in the Ministry of National Development and the Office of the General Secretary that worked on a lot of ideas that then became the foundation and the basis for projects that the party proposed and the government accepted and implemented. So in some regards, he worked there behind the scenes. He wasn't a minister at that time. He wasn't very evident on the political landscape in terms of the cabinet and government, but was certainly very instrumental behind the scenes in churning out a whole range of ideas that were then tested and implemented. Elvin then subsequently went on as Guyana continued its outreach internationally, creating relations across the globe. He went on to be the country's first ambassador to the then Soviet Union. So again, here was Elvin playing a very critical role in terms of Guyana's relations with what one would then refer to as the Eastern Bloc. Probably that happened on the heels of his involvement locally in the Peace Council work. Elvin was also very active in establishing in Guyana more or less the Peace Council that was very much in tune with the Peace Council that operated largely in the Eastern Bloc at that time. And so he was very much acquainted, by the time he became ambassador, with what pertained in the Eastern Bloc, to which he became our first ambassador. He then subsequently returned home to be a presidential advisor to Lyndon Fobbs Sampson Burnham. And he held that position until Burnham's demise. And so we see that Elvin McDavid had quite a long career serving the founder and contributing to the growth and development of Guyana. It was after the death of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham that he, in a sense, retired, but then founded the Burnham Foundation. And so this foundation will continue to be a legacy of the work of Elvin McDavid as we continue to pay tribute to the founder of this nation, Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham.
That was a very good piece, Mr. Alexander. I recognize your wide knowledge of Mr. McDavid's engagement with the party and the work and legacy of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. Since we last met, you know, the foundation has been engaged in a number of activities, and we have been trying to promote the work of Forbes Burnham in this country. And today we'll be having a next program which seeks to highlight or bring to the attention of our supporters, viewers, and sympathizers, people who support Burnham, another such program. It will be held this afternoon at 3 o'clock at the Critchlow Labour College, where we'll be looking at but you know the party was formed, the party that Burnham founded, the PNC, came into being in the month of October 1955. And today we will try to look at what was responsible for the coming into being of the PNC and the contribution that the party has made and Forbes Burnham towards the advancement of the people of Guyana, as well as the people of the region in relation to development. Now, today we also would like to bring to your attention that we intend to have, during the month of October, which is Agricultural Month, a program that we describe as the Producers' Day. That is, people who are involved in agriculture. We hope to have an activity. Tentatively, we plan to have it in the compound of ACDA, the Producers' Day. But we have not kind of finalized those details as yet. But when that happens, obviously, we'll be bringing the information to your attention so you can support the program. The Producers' Day will focus largely on agricultural activities and the work of our sculptors, our cultural kind of personalities in the country that do art and so on. We would like to highlight those things on Producers' Day in the compound of ACDA. But we will be telling you more about that at a later stage. Today we'll be focusing, like I said, on the contribution of the party, Forbes Burnham Party, the PNC, how it came into being, why it came into being, and its contribution towards the development of the people of this country. I have with me Mr. Vincent Alexander, chairman of the foundation, and one individual who, as well as Mr. McDavid, worked together with Forbes Burnham. In fact, in those days, he was considered a youth. I think he will tell me today that he's still a youth. He worked closely with Forbes Burnham on developmental activities, particularly you know that Forbes Burnham had a knack for young people. He loved young people. And as a result of that, he created institutions that promoted the work and interests of young people. The GNS was one of them. He even had a program dedicated a whole week during the year for Youth Week. That is the kind of interest he showed in the young people of this country. So today I want to invite Mr. Alexander to go back in history and let us look at what gave birth to the PNC and its contribution to Guyana. Mr. Alexander.
Thank you very much, Clayton. Clayton, I think there's one first point I must clarify. There are different views expressed in relation to the birthday of the People's National Congress.
That's why I said in the month of October.
Right. We know that before you had a party named the People's National Congress, there was a split in the PPP that led to the PPP Jaganite faction and the PPP Burnhamite faction. That split occurred in 1955. In 1957 it was that the faction, PPP Burnhamite faction, was renamed People's National Congress. And there are those who would argue that 57 therefore is the birthday of the People's National Congress. But there are others who would argue from a very organic perspective that the birthday had to be the time of the split. Because though after the split, that group was not referred to immediately as the People's National Congress, it is that group that was the organic beginning of the party, and therefore may well be referred to as the embryonic and beginning stages of the PNC. And so there are those who contribute that to the birthday. So we may be saying that if the birthday is in 1955, then in fact what we are celebrating is the 49th birth anniversary, the 49th anniversary of the birth of the People's National Congress. So I think that's important to note, that there may be different views and that both views have rather arguments to support them. But the fact of the matter is, in 1955, there was a split, and the Burnham faction walked away, in a sense, from the PPP. And even that is a dispute. In fact, I think I need to retract, not to say the Burnham faction walked away from the PPP, because in fact, on the occasion of the split, it was the Jaganite faction that walked out of the Congress. And so really, for all intents and purposes, in a sense, at that point, what remained was the PPP, and that was the Burnhamite faction. But they then accepted the parting and accepted that there were two factions, and Burnham then changed the name from Burnhamite faction to the PNC and gave up, in a sense, the name PPP to that party, which still retains that name today. But the birth of the PNC is founded, in fact, in issues within the PPP itself. There are different people who take different perspectives on this matter of what caused the birth of the PNC. There were those who would want to say that it was purely because of Burnham's machinations on power that the People's National Congress came into existence. And very often they use his sister's letter, Beware of My Brother Forbes, as the basis for that argument, as well as they attribute it to other things that may have happened in the party. Now, Beware of My Brother Forbes was a letter written by Jessie Burnham, where she talked about her brother's ambition, even as a young man, to become a leader and the president. And she seemed to want to argue that it's that ambition that led to the split. The fact of the matter is that there's really nothing wrong with a young man aspiring. Absolutely nothing wrong. Something would be rather wrong if somebody didn't aspire and then became a leader and a president. Because in aspiring, obviously there's a vision and there's an idea and there's some driving force behind that aspiration. So we could easily dismiss the criticism of Burnham aspiring. What else should a young man do other than have some ambition, some goal in life? And if Burnham had that goal of becoming a leader, then there's absolutely wrong with that. And we saw the benefits of that vision from his youthful days. But we ought to recognize that it wasn't just magic that made him the leader that he became. It was his own brilliance, the recognition of his brilliance, that led to that. Because the fact of the matter is that when the PPP was being formed, coming out of the PAC, there were Guyanese and Caribbean leaders who by that time had recognized Burnham as a student in London and the good work that he was doing as a student, and as at that time a member. I think he had joined the Communist Party as well in London. He had even gone to represent the students at the Youth Festival in Czechoslovakia. He was a leader of the West Indian student community in London. He was recognized for his oratory, given awards. And so there was the man growing into the political animal that he became. And there was a recognition of that by leaders, anti-colonial leaders in the Caribbean, and I dare say even further afield. And it's out of that recognition that came the recommendation that Burnham should be embraced by the formative PPP as one of its leaders. And if I'm not mistaken, when he left London, he came to Guyana via Jamaica. He came to Guyana via Jamaica, where he met with Manley. Where he met with Manley, the then leader in Jamaica, as a part of the orientation, because Manley was then seen as one of the leaders of the anti-colonial struggle in the West Indies. And so he came to Guyana via Jamaica, where he had some mentorship, some inauguration with Manley, and then came home and joined with Jagan to form the People's Progressive Party, of which he was the first chairperson. So that we see the growth of Burnham. We see that in 1953, that party won an overwhelming majority and was called upon to form the government. But we also see that that government was short-lived because of British intervention. But we see Burnham all the time learning lessons along the way and trying to be very strategic. One of the reasons why the government was short-lived was because the British felt that there was a threat in the sense that the PPP at that time was a heavy leftist party. We knew of the events in Cuba. We knew of the dynamics of the struggle for power across the globe. And the manner of conduct, which they were entitled to, of the PPP at that time, posed some concern to the British. And whether justifiably or not, and I would say not justifiably, they suspended the Constitution, and the government, the popular government, was removed from the seat of government, and an interim government was put in place. Now, Burnham obviously addressed his mind to these issues and recognized that whilst the British were wrong to have done what they did, that one has to live recognizing the realities of life and navigating through those realities. And so Burnham was unprepared in the face of being a leader in a colony to hold on steadfast to rhetoric about the construction of socialism when we were still a colony and not yet independent. Unfortunately, Cheddi Jagan held on to that rhetoric, and I think that became one of the major, if not the major issue of departure. That though they may have been committed to the same goals for the development of Guyana, Burnham had a different view in terms of the strategic approach to the achievement of the goal, and is on record as saying very clearly that you could not, in fact, build socialism in a colony. And therefore, even if your ultimate objective was the construction of socialism, you first of all had to overcome the obstacle of being a colony. And you had to achieve decolonization. And so Burnham had that difference with Cheddi Jagan, who until the day of his death held on to his Marxist philosophy. And in fact, out of that came the difference in the leadership of the PPP, and out of that came the split. I think the nation needs to understand that clearly, that it is that difference in strategy, in pursuit of Guyana's development, that party eventually split.
I tell you, Vincent, if we are to cover the contribution of Forbes Burnham on this program, we wouldn't have adequate time, because what you have said is a good lesson in the history of the PNC. And I know our viewers, we will be giving you an opportunity to call in on this program today, so you can also make your contribution on this program. But like I said, we're looking at the history of the PNC and Burnham's contribution. I think you have given a very good background in terms of the formation and the launching of the...
That is but the beginning.
The beginning, I said.
Another argument that is proffered by some people is that essentially the split represented ethnic forces going their different ways. I don't think that argument again holds water, because when the split occurred, one could see that the people who were the hard left stayed with Jagan, and the people who were more pragmatic and nationalistic went with Burnham, and that was not based on ethnicity. You had people like E.U.C. Guyana, who in the first instance stayed with Jagan. You had people like Rory Westmus, who stayed with Jagan, and these were not Indo-Guyanese, but they stayed because of their hard left position.
The belief in...
And you had other people who were Indo-Guyanese who went with Burnham. And again, they went with Burnham because they were more nationalistic and more pragmatic. And so, again, one needs to put in the record that though eventually we may have seen a configuration of parties that were essentially representing different ethnic groups, that when the leadership parted way, it was not based on ethnicity. It was based on ideological perspective. It is true that the ethnic groups may have followed those ultimate leaders, the Indo-Guyanese following Jagan and the Afro-Guyanese following Burnham. But what led Burnham to where he went was not ethnicity. It was clear ideological difference with Jagan, and that is best manifest by the fact that there were Afro-Guyanese who stayed in the leadership of the PPP at that time, and there were Indo-Guyanese who stayed in the leadership of the People's National Congress, just showing that the foundation of these parties and the differences of these parties were really ideological and not ethnic in nature.
Yes, so I am going to be opening the lines in another 2 minutes, but before we go to that, I know we have done on this program before a number of topics that address the contribution of Forbes Burnham towards the development of the people of this country. And I seem to recall one aspect where we had, I think it was Dr. Norton, where we addressed the question of Amerindian development. Today, you hear about the Amerindian, we're still in Amerindian Heritage Month. You hear about the Amerindians as though it's the first time since 1992 the interests of the Amerindians have been taken into account. But it was pointed out on this program that even before independence, Burnham had to take on board the interests of the Amerindians to facilitate the country's independence. I want you to address that matter a little bit before I go to the lines.
Well, this is quite coincidental, because we're now coming out of Amerindian month, a month which is attributed to Chedi Jagan. But certainly it goes back to the point I was making about the split not being an ethnic split and a strategy. And we see that an important part of Burnham's undertaking early on, before Guyana became independent, was to address issues of all of the ethnic groups. And so, for example, we saw that the whole question of the Amerindian Land Commission came into vogue, and that a commitment of Burnham to work with the output of that land commission, the output of which is still relevant today. Every time we hear about demarcation of Amerindian lands, the foundation of that idea, of that project, has to be attributed to Burnham's commitment at the time of independence to address the Amerindian issue. And that commission predated the PPP by decades and saw a gradual implementation starting with the Burnham regime. So the foundation of the solution to the Amerindian problem is founded in Burnham's commitment to building a nation that would address the problems of all of the Guyanese people. It is for that reason, too, that even at the level of the acquisition of independence, it was agreed to have established the office of the Ombudsman because of issues that were expressed about the nature of the public service and the non-Indian composition of the public service at that time. So all of these issues, these national issues, were on the front burner, and we saw constitutional mechanisms being put in place under the Burnham regime to address these issues, mechanisms some of which have survived on today, some of which have been ignored for significant periods. We've only this year, after over a decade, had the appointment of an ombudsman who could address issues within the public service. We have not had the appointment of the Public Service Appellate Tribunal for some time now. But all of these were institutions that one could see were crafted to address the nature of our society. And I think it's important to mention as well, Clayton, that this issue of independence became a very critical issue of departure between Burnham and Jagan, because Jagan persisted even after the split in certain declarations and pronouncements that were inimical to us getting independence.
To the advancement of the people.
Whilst Burnham strategically decided that he had to go after independence first and committed to independence by all means, whilst Jagan insisted on certain things that became obstacles to the extent that when we came to the point of finalizing our instruments for independence, Jagan was not present at those conferences. It was Burnham and Degar who were present at those conferences. And so when one talks, for example, about Jagan being the father of the nation, it is very difficult to understand how one could be given that accolade when in fact in the negotiations for the realization of independence, Jagan was absent, voluntarily absent, because he had contentions that in fact were obstacles to the attainment of independence, whilst Burnham had positions that facilitated the attainment of independence,
if I recall,
and led to him being involved in the conferences.
If I recall, on one of these programs, Mr. Jailal Kisoon did say that Jagan had agreed that the decision of the Governor General was the one which he was prepared
I think
to
it's
accept.
the Duncan Sands matter.
Yeah, Duncan Sands.
It's the issue of proportional representation versus the first past the post system. When at one of the conferences, the question of the electoral system was being discussed.
Yes.
And there was no consensus between the local parties. And in that circumstance, Duncan Sands made a proposal that probably he should be allowed to determine the electoral system to be used. Burnham initially objected to that because Burnham felt it's a matter we should resolve among ourselves. Jagan very early conceded that Duncan Sands should have that right. And subsequently, in the interest of compromise and movement, Burnham said, well, if you concede, let Duncan Sands decide. Duncan Sands subsequently decided it should be PR. But today, in this country, there's a lot of propaganda which seeks to suggest that PR is merely a product of the manipulation of the British and the Americans to get Chedi out of government. When in fact, PR is a manifestation of the confidence that Chedi placed in the British. When he said to Duncan Sands, you may
make the decision. A decision which subsequently was PR, and he came back and had a campaign in this country that there would be no elections if there's PR. And that was a part of the disturbances that this country experienced when the PPP sought to ensure there were no elections. And in fact, when they lost the elections, under the provisions of our laws, refused to demit office.
and had to be removed by an order in council by the governor. So we have this history of the PPP always resisting legitimate and legal action. And so it brings into vogue the whole question of some of the things that are happening today. One of which, just by way of example, in 2012, we had legislation that postponed local government elections to 2013. In 2013, the government did not bring legislation to postpone local government elections. So it meant that, in fact, by the time we got to December 2013 and beyond, the government was in defiance of the law
the Constitution.
and the Constitution that required elections by December 2013. There was a bill that was brought, that was approved by the Parliament for elections by August. The President refused to sign. So in fact, what we happen is a minister of the government who are in defiance of the law of 2012 for elections to be held the latest December 2013. And so I'm just using that as an example to show that there's a historic antecedent of the PPP defying the legal order of the country, a defiance which was manifest in 1964 when they lost the elections and when the governor did what a governor had the right to do, to bring together the two parties that formed the majority and ask them to form the government, and they refused to demit office.
I want to tell our viewers that I know for us to cover all the things on Forbes Burnham, his party, and what he has done for the people of Guyana, it will be difficult on this program. But I'm using Mr. Alexander to deal with some specific issues. We have addressed that. And, of course, but the lines are now open, and you may make a contribution too. But before we go to the lines, I want Mr. Alexander to deal with the question of Burnham and youth, the young people of today, his vision, what he did for the young people, and how he did it.
Well, I think it's interesting.
I'm picking these subjects random because we have dealt with Burnham and foreign policy, Burnham and education, Burnham and local government, Burnham and sports, culture, Burnham and the non-aligned movement, all these things. But I want you to talk about Forbes Burnham and youth.
It's interesting, that today we're going to talk about that, because today, as we celebrate the life of Elvin McDavid, his life is one of the manifestations of Burnham's disposition to the youth. Because Elvin was quite a young man, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in his late 20s, when Burnham made him a minister, showing confidence in the youth. At that time, he was not the only young minister. There were other young ministers. You had the history of Jeffrey Thomas, a young minister. You subsequently had the history of Simpson de Silva, who became, after Elvin, the youngest minister Burnham appointed. But he demonstrated a confidence in young people by virtue of the opportunities provided them to participate in nation building at the highest possible level. And in recognition of that, he created the Youth Division, which at that time was a part of the office of the Prime Minister. He considered the youth so important that issues pertaining to the youth came directly under his ambit. And you had in the office of the Prime Minister the Youth Division, which Burnham himself oversaw, with assistance from time to time of either a parliamentary secretary or a junior minister of youth. Now, that Youth Division was the driving force in a lot of things pertaining to the young people in this country. They had all sorts of programs that were organized by the Youth Division. We know that Burnham also dedicated an entire week in the month of May, the month of independence, to what we call Youth Week, where he allowed for young people to be involved in various fora, to be involved in various manifestations, and to be able to discuss issues pertaining to the youth that would eventually find themselves onto the national agenda. So Burnham was very, very much disposed towards the youth, and it's through that disposition that he also created the National Service, to give young people who had missed their first chance a second chance. And today we have stellar examples of those young people. I think that Mr. Gavaya would be first to admit that he was one of the beneficiaries of that organization and was able to move on from national service to be the entrepreneur he is today and a leading person in the field of aviation.
Well, there are lots of young people coming out from the Guyana National Service that are holding very senior positions in the region and further afield, and you have a number of them in business, those who are exposed to skills training, mechanic, auto electrician, electricians, and so on, who are now doing very good work around this country, within this country. Some of them have their own businesses. And like I said, the lines are now open. You are free to call in to make a contribution to this program. I was just picking the various kind of subjects and areas at random to address this question of Forbes Burnham. I wish to remind you also that this afternoon we'll be having a program at the Critchlow Labour College at 3 o'clock.
4 o'clock.
At 4 o'clock. We'll be looking at the formation of the PNC, its history, its contribution towards the people of this country, what Forbes Burnham has done for the people of this country. We hear all sorts of things going on in the media today. Well, of course, you know, some people try to discredit Forbes Burnham, but he stands head and shoulders above every leader of this region for the 20th century. You know, he was nominated and voted as the Caribbean man of the 20th century. So, without doubt, so you come this afternoon and it is free. You don't have to pay. Come to Critchlow at 4 o'clock and you will be given information about this great son of Guyana.
I think an important point to note as the PNC celebrates its anniversary is that Burnham was keen on establishing national institutions. His approach to national development was also an institutional approach. It was not just issue of projects, it was the issue of creating institutions. And if one looks at history, one will see that all the developed countries have, over a period of time, sought to sustain their development and to fuel their development by the creation of institutions, an institutional approach. And one could name a number of institutions that Burnham created that have lived on. I think at the top of the agenda one would easily mention the NIS as an institution that he created that serves a purpose, and we see it as very integral to the lives of our elder citizens today. Now, the People's National Congress was probably the first institution in this country outside of the PPP, which he also helped to create, that Burnham created and has lived on.
Well, it has been reported in one of these programs that Forbes Burnham, he actually wrote the Constitution for the People's Progressive Party. The Constitution that they used to do.
Right. So that as we celebrate their anniversary, we have to attribute the existence of the People's National Congress as an institution to Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. He almost single-handedly created the institution. And we saw that the institution went through phases of development. It was not a stagnated institution. He took it from one level to another depending on what was required of a party in the nation and what was in fact happening in the nation itself. So Burnham must be seen as a builder of institutions, as the basis for national growth and national development. And the People's National Congress, which today has survived, notwithstanding all of the problems it may have had, has survived because of the institutional foundation that Burnham gave to that organization, an institutional framework that he created for that organization.
Yeah, I want to remind our viewers that the Burnham Foundation is dedicated towards keeping you informed as to the work, legacy of Forbes Burnham, some of the things he did. That's one of the reasons why we're having these programs, and we encourage you to get on board. And this afternoon is an ideal opportunity if you want to become involved, if you would like to share your ideas in terms of what else can be done to enhance the work of the foundation. Feel free to attend this afternoon's activity at the Critchlow Labour College at 4 o'clock. And you will be, I'm sure, satisfied with the information that will be given to you at today's forum, because we'll be looking at the like we're doing today, the history of the formation of the party and its contribution. We cannot cover all those things on this program, but so we're saying to you, come this afternoon and you will be able to have more information on what has been done, the reason for them, the strategy being applied in relation to advancing the interests and the work of the people of this country. And so we're encouraging you to come this afternoon. The lines are going. Yes, morning. I missed that call. Yes, I'm saying you can come this afternoon and be assured that much more will be given to you. We have picked the youth, we have picked them on other things. Burnham also contributed to this question of course, I know leaders of the region, Mr. Manley, Errol Barrow, Eric Williams, Dr. Eric Williams, at one point made it very clear at one of the heads of government meeting that there is no better tribute that can be given to the work of Forbes Burnham than citing the headquarters of the CARICOM Secretariat in Guyana when some other leaders were saying that it should be held elsewhere. I want you to just comment on Forbes Burnham and CARICOM.
Well, Forbes Burnham is obviously one of the founders of CARICOM and was a very fervent fighter for Caribbean integration. We know that even before CARICOM, there were other attempts between Burnham, Barrow, and Bear Bird.
Yeah.
We had the CARIFTA that predated CARICOM. So that one has to associate this whole question of the CARICOM also with Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham and his vision for an integrated Caribbean. You know, it happened so that people like Manley, in this instance Michael Manley, Errol Barrow, Forbes Burnham, they all studied in London and were able at that time to start to have a shared vision for the Caribbean people. And having studied and having returned to the Caribbean, to the West Indies, sought to implement that vision. Now that was very much unlike the posture of the People's Progressive Party at that time. They were not for integration. They had an ideological position which suggested that integration was really an attempt by the colonizers to create a neo-colonial arrangement, to have us all into one cluster and to be able to perpetuate the arrangements of colonialism through a neo-colonial arrangement. And so they were not protagonists for integration at that time because they saw integration as not being progressive. But Forbes Burnham had the vision along with his colleagues, Barrow and Williams and Bird, and they forged a way. And hence we have CARICOM today, something which all of us are involved in, something which the present government states its commitment to, but always seek to downplay the role of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, who stayed the course. You know, when one considered that the Federation failed and the way in which it easily folded up, one has to give some tribute to those leaders who formed CARICOM, because CARICOM has had its challenges. But in the face of those challenges, under the leadership of those leaders, particularly the founding leaders, Barrow and Burnham and Williams and Bird, CARICOM has stayed the course. So CARICOM in some regards is a monument to the commitment of people like Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham.
You know, every time you listen to some different views being expressed today, you hear Forbes Burnham name being denigrated. And today we're talking about local government. And that was one of the areas of passion for Forbes Burnham. And because of our country, because of the geography of our country, where our people live, this question of local government and community development happens to be one of those areas that Burnham sought to really he worked on, particularly to ensure that there is involvement of the people at the local level with their development. I want you to just touch a
Well,
little
you
bit
know,
on Burnham and
it
local
is, it's a
government.
highly held view in the Caribbean in particular, and probably universally, that local government is the place where you breed your national politicians. We have a situation today where people come into politics at the national level and have absolutely no exposure at the lower level of politics. And partly because the system does not facilitate that exposure. The local government system has been in tatters and has not facilitated. But if you look at the emergence of Burnham, even Jagan, they were themselves involved in local government before they came to national government. They did their apprenticeship at the local level. Burnham was a mayor of the city of Georgetown. So he did his apprenticeship at local government and then moved on. And that is one of the roles that local government plays, apart from the fact that local government is an organ for the democratic involvement of the people at large. And again, one has to contribute, one has to recognize Burnham, because our constitution is the only constitution in the English-speaking Caribbean that enshrines local government. Nowhere else in the English-speaking Caribbean have they elevated local government to the level of constitutional arrangements. And so that's another achievement of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, the elevation of local government, notwithstanding the fact it's being desecrated these days, of local government to the level of the national constitution.
Yeah, that's one of the areas I think I wanted you to really talk on, and these are all issues that I hope will come out this afternoon at the Critchlow Labour College when you get there. Forbes Burnham and foreign policy.
No, I think in terms of Critchlow this afternoon, what the focus will very well be is the whole question of Burnham, a vision of a nation called Guyana. I think that's where one has to go. All that we are seeing are parts of this bigger picture of Burnham, a vision for Guyana. And in that vision, in the first instance, he sought to give Guyana an identity as a nation in the world of nations. And so his focus was on identity. And so the things he did in terms of culture, the things he did in terms of sports, the things he did in terms of our foreign policy, gave us a distinctive identity in the international community. Now it's with that identity that you could then build and move on to have the kind of national development that was required. And so I think critical was how Burnham sought to develop a sense of pride in being Guyanese, creating the Guyana man, so that Guyana man could then have that kind of attachment to his country, that home and or abroad, he would be an ongoing contributor to the country's development. I think that's the foundation Burnham sought to build for this country, creating the Guyana man, giving a vision for Guyanese and for Guyana, and giving us a kind of national pride that would lend to our involvement in all that we became involved in, all the self-help Guyanese became involved in. All of this fantastic work done by our diplomats overseas came out of a sense of being that Burnham inculcated in this country, and which is probably his most fundamental contribution to Guyana, to make it a place to which we felt, irrespective of ethnicity, that we belong, and a place which we wanted to call and to make our home.
But of course, that conviction and that inner feeling obviously influenced Forbes Burnham foreign policy in terms of the country's kind of relationship with other international organizations and other nations. And that's that's the reason why I mentioned that Forbes Burnham foreign policy. But as being that, I think what might be useful, because we have about another 6 minutes, we have another 6 minutes. I want you to touch briefly on Forbes Burnham and education, an area that is very dear to Forbes Burnham.
Two things I want to say. Let me start off closing off on the foreign policy point. Burnham always argued that foreign policy is the extension of national policy. And I think most governments across the globe accept that argument. That really when you have a foreign policy, what you're seeking to do is to pursue your national interests beyond your borders. And Burnham was clearly into that, and we saw where, as small a nation as we were, that we were able to use our foreign policy as our first line of defense in the face of aggression on our borders and things like that. And so he had a very effective foreign policy. Burnham and education, undoubtedly. Burnham saw education as that institution that was going to be the liberating force of the ordinary man in Guyana. And so he did his utmost to develop an education policy that gave opportunities to everyone. Hence, his policy of education free of cost from nursery to university. It was a reflection of his belief that education was critical to national development. Now, it is also noteworthy that in 1963, Chedi Jagan conceptualized our tertiary education system by establishing the University of Guyana. But one has to accept that in 1964, Chedi was no longer in government. And so what became of the university from 1964 and beyond reflected Burnham's commitment to education. He did not seek to destroy. You know, there are those who would argue that Burnham probably was not in favor of the University of Guyana before Chedi establishes and all of that. We could debate that issue. But the fact of the matter is he demonstrated a commitment to that university and did not, out of any spite, out of any dislike for the things that Chedi created, go and close it down. He saw it through that stage of its early development onto where it probably is today. And so it is another demonstrative fact of Burnham and his disposition to education. And Burnham saw education. Burnham made it clear in his policy position in education that education should not be seen as people being able to regurgitate books and things like that. He saw education as a tool that could be used for understanding situations, for the application of knowledge to development. It's not just certification and being able to repeat things as if one, was the foundation of all knowledge. He saw education more important, and therefore you could see the things he did. The idea behind the community high schools. Community high schools, very, very sound philosophical idea about giving opportunity to people who might not have been purely academically oriented, but giving them the skills and the competencies to be able to make a contribution to their own development and to national development. We saw the way in which he developed the idea of the multilateral schools. And they were not called multilateral schools for the sake of calling them multilateral schools. Multi meant many lateral.
Many laterals.
So across the board, in the multilateral school, one could be pursuing the academic stream, one could pursue the technical stream, because it was multilateral, and the schools were physically built to facilitate multilateral education. And those schools are still with us today, though one could question whether the curriculum today is still a multilateral curriculum. But those schools were well outfitted, showing the clear intention of Burnham to provide a rounded education to the Guyanese. One must never forget the numerous scholarships that Burnham also provided for Guyanese in Guyana and overseas. I think if you were to go to the record of the scholarship provided, that the per capita provision of scholarships in Guyana probably one of the highest anywhere in the world. And more than that, notwithstanding the propaganda we are subjected to, one would see that the scholarships again cut across the ethnic divide, and that Guyanese of all ethnic groups,
they were given
even
an
where
opportunity.
some were trying to propagate otherwise, were given an opportunity to get scholarships home and abroad to foster their personal development and national development as well.
I see the lights are going, and I want to take this opportunity to remind you of today's activity at 4 o'clock at the Coachella Labor College. It's free to the public. The public is invited. You can come. Just come there at 4 o'clock. And I want to thank you very much, Mr. Alexander, for being with me on today's program, The State of the Nation. And I give you an opportunity to say your last
Well,
words.
I think I sensed there was a technical problem with the phone this morning. I sensed there was a technical problem. So for those people who might have attempted to call in and didn't come through, we apologize. But I sensed that there was a technical problem. We closed today in recognition of the fact that the People's National Congress has now achieved, or is on the verge of achieving, 49 years of existence, and that 49 years of existence has to be attributed to Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, the founder of that party. The Burnham Foundation itself is not a part of the People's National Congress reform, though we are prepared to work and to collaborate with them. We are a non-governmental organization dedicated keeping the legacy of Burnham alive. And therefore today, if the People's National Congress is his legacy, then we owe it to Forbes Burnham to have highlighted that he created that institution which still serves the nation today.
All right, and with that, we come to the end of today's program. I'm your host, Clayton Hinds, saying thank you until the next 4th Sunday, when I'll be back with you again with another program, The State of the Nation. Thank you.